Hello and welcome. This interview is a part of a series I'm doing to publicize the 2023 conference of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. The conference is called CSICon, and it'll take place in Las Vegas from October 26th through the 29th. Today's guest is Dr. Paul Offit, who will be speaking at CSICon about a very important topic, COVID vaccination. And before I bring him on, let me tell you a bit about him by excerpting the description of Dr. Offit from the CSICon speaker site. Paul A. Offit, MD, is a director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, as well as the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology and the Professor of Pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a recipient of many awards, including the J. Edmund Bradley Prize for Excellence in Pediatrics from the University of Maryland Medical School, and the Young Investigator Award in Vaccine Development from the Infectious Disease Society of America. Dr. Offit has published more than 160 papers in medical and scientific journals in the areas of rotavirus-specific immune responses and vaccine safety. He is also the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine RotaTeq, recommended for universal use in infants by the CDC and by the WHO. He is also an author of books including Deadly Choices, How the Anti-Vaccine Movement Threatens Us All, and Do You Believe in Magic? The Sense and Nonsense of Alternative Medicine. His newest book, due out in 2024, is Tell Me When It's Over, Living with COVID in a Post-Pandemic World. Welcome, Dr. Offit. Thanks so much for agreeing to do this with me.
My pleasure.
So before we get to talk about your CSICon talk, I want to discuss a few things, including your involvement with a new documentary to be screened at the conference, Virulent: The Vaccine War. This will be shown in its entirety at CSICon this year. And I had the opportunity to interview its creators, Laura and Chartis, last week. That interview should be published just before this one goes out. I was able to watch the film and prep for the interview, and it turns out that you were their medical advisor. So I wanted to ask you, how did that come about, and what was the experience like?
I had done a film about polio before, and so I think maybe that's how they came to know me, because I think they're out of Pittsburgh, I've been fairly active in terms of commenting about anti-vaccine activism and so taking that on for the last 20 years or so. So I think that's why they came to choose me.
Okay, so what did you think of the experience?
Well, I enjoy it. I mean, I always enjoy talking about sort of the science of vaccines or the science of vaccine safety or the history of vaccines. I'm always less comfortable about talking about myself or about my past experiences or about my childhood, because it really isn't about me. But that was the only somewhat uncomfortable part. But otherwise, I really enjoyed it. You know, as long as the filmmaker has a point of view that is consistent with the science, it's going to be fun. But if it's set up as a kind of he said, she said, and we want to be fair and balanced, and we want to show both sides of a subject, when only one side is supported by the science, and that becomes uncomfortable.
So were you comfortable with did you look at their previous work or something to know that that wasn't going to be the case, that it was going to be he said, she said?
Exactly. I mean, Laura Davis was great. I mean, I guess I'd known her for a little while, but I knew that it was going to be true to the science. They cared. They care about making sure that people aren't given bad information that causes them to put themselves or their children in harm's way. So it's a passion for Laura. She's great.
Yeah. So the film postulates two main reasons for vaccine resistance. One being personal freedom, and the other, the naturalistic fallacy. And one thing you said in the film regarding that second reason stuck with me. It was really good. Mother Nature's been trying to kill us. You said something like, since we crawled out of the swamp or something. It's like, yeah. So your push back on the nature is good for us belief expressed by vaccine opponents, was fantastic. One horrendous example I've written about before is Gwyneth Paltrow, who unfortunately has a lot of influence among some of these people. And she actually said something which was quoted at the beginning of Science Mom's documentary, also screened at CSICon a long time ago. I don't think anything that is natural can be bad for you. So it astounds me that this is a widespread belief, despite, just thinking about it for a moment. Cancer from the sun, natural poisons, dangerous animals, most of the universe, most of the earth will kill you. So why do people persist in believing this?
Good marketing. I mean, I give Mother Nature credit. I don't know who her public relations team is, but I think we should find out. I mean, polio is natural, malaria is natural. Those are all natural phenomena. Mosquitoes are natural. I just want to know who her PR team is because they're doing a great job. Yeah, no, what's interesting, just because you alluded to this earlier, is there was never really a politics of the anti-vaccine movement, which began with the first vaccine, in the early 1800s following the smallpox vaccine. And on the left, it was always this, just what you said, sort of, all things natural. I don't want to be given anything, injected with something that's unnatural. The kind of gluten-free, casein-free, bisphenol A-free crowd. And on the right, it was the government off my back, the sort of libertarian freedom to do what I want. That has dramatically changed during this pandemic. I mean, this pandemic is now almost solely a phenomenon of this kind of libertarian left hook, kind of government off my back. You're much more likely to die if you live in an area that heavily voted for Donald Trump than if you lived in an area that heavily voted for Joseph Biden. So it's the first time, I think, in history that your political affiliation determined whether or not you were going to live or die from a virus. Yeah, we want the freedom to catch and transmit and die from viral infections, preventable viral infections.
So at one point, Laura and Chartis took a look at your childhood in the film, and they told a tale of how and why you took an interest in making vaccinations your life work. And I found that fascinating, having to do with polio. Can you share that story with us?
Sure. So when I was born, I had club feet, and which means that your feet turn sort of down and inward. And it was treated the way it should have been treated initially, which is with casting. So you're in cast for several months, and then ultimately your feet straighten out to some extent. At the age of 5, my father didn't like it that my right heel didn't hit the ground, so he wanted it to be operated on. So my mother was able to get an appointment actually at the club foot clinic at Hopkins, and it was hard to do that. Initially, she was told it was going to be months, but my grandfather's brother was a bookie, really Baltimore's biggest bookie, and so she called him, and then he called the head of the clinic, who apparently was a gambler, and that enabled me to get an appointment really within a week. And when he examined my foot, he said, quote, "Whatever you do, don't operate on this foot." But my father just didn't like it that my foot wasn't straight, and so he got a friend of his son, who had just recently finished his orthopedic residency, to operate on my right foot, and it went badly. And as a consequence, I ended up being in a chronic care facility, Kernan. It was then called Kernan's Hospital for Crippled Children, because that's at a time in the mid-1950s when you could use words like crippled and feeble-minded in the names of children's hospitals. But so I was there for about 6 weeks recovering, and it was a polio ward, because a chronic care facility for young children in the 1950s was a polio ward. So I remember polio. I mean,
this didn't risk infecting you, being in a ward with people with polio?
Sure. Yeah, of course. They were recovering from polio, but yeah, sure, of course. But that's true anyway. I mean, you're always at some risk out there in the summer. My parents were certainly very good about making sure that we never went to public swimming pools, that we would just swim in a little plastic thing in the back of the house. But sure, yeah, that was a risk. This was the 1950s. There was 1 visiting hour a week on Sundays from 2 to 3. My mother was ill with a complication with a pregnancy with my brother. My father was a traveling salesman, so he actually wasn't able to visit. So I was pretty much there by myself for about 6 weeks. And I remember my bed was right next to a window that looked onto the front of the hospital, the front door of the hospital. So I just remember staring out that window, hoping someone would come save me. But what I remember most is I remember children in iron lungs. I remember the so-called Sister Kenny treatments, where they would take these hot packs and put it on these where their arms and legs, which were excruciatingly hot. And I remember the screaming of those children. I remember the rhythmic sound of the iron lungs. It was literally hell on earth. And I think that scarred me. I really do think that the passions of our adulthood invariably come from the scars of our childhood. And that was a scarring event. And I think seeing those children for what they were, as vulnerable, helpless, and alone, seeing myself in the same way, I think ultimately drew me to pediatrics. I think ultimately it drew me to pediatric infectious diseases. And I think the first book that I ever wrote was a book about a disaster associated with the polio vaccine called the Cutter Incident. I'm sure that was all, all hard work for that was all driven by the scars of that 6-week event.
Wow. So let's talk about the rotavirus vaccine. So I know that you went on to create that, and my limited knowledge of that virus is that it's killed 100,000 children worldwide. It does every year, apparently. I read this in Wikipedia the other day. Oddly, maybe because I don't have children, I've never heard of this virus before. Maybe it's more prevalent in the undeveloped world.
No,
So how,
no one gets stage 5 without being infected with rotavirus. They cause a fever and vomiting and diarrhea, primarily in the child between 6 and 24 months of age. Every child who was born before that vaccine became routinely available in 2006 would have suffer rotavirus. It's that common. If when you do seroepidemiological surveys of 10-year-old children, you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who didn't have an antibody response to that virus.
did people not die if you were living in a country with a good medical system? And
Yes, and that's the difference. Worldwide, there's about 500,000 deaths per year pre-vaccine, and about as many as 2,000 deaths a day. In this country, because we have better medical services, there's about 75,000 hospitalizations a year and about 60 deaths per year pre-vaccine. But for my part, I mean, I was when I entered a pediatric infectious disease fellowship, I chose to study rotaviruses with two amazing people. Stanley Plotkin, who had already developed the rubella vaccine, the so-called RA27 three-strain rubella vaccine. He did important critical work on the current rabies vaccine, the so-called diploid cell vaccine. He did work on anthrax and the anthrax vaccine. He had a lot of experience going from bench to bedside. And then the other person in that team was Dr. Fred Clark, who was a veterinarian and PhD who had done a lot of work with both large and small animal models. So he, because this was the vaccine that we created, was ultimately a combination virus between a bovine or cow virus and a human virus. I mean, his knowledge of animal pathogenesis for a variety of viruses was amazing. I mean, I was just really lucky. I was just lucky to be with these two amazing people and be part of that team at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia that ultimately created a rotavirus vaccine that was recommended for all children in this country by the CDC, and then ultimately for all children in the world by the World Health Organization in roughly the same year, 2006.
all right, so let's talk about your COVID work. I remember seeing you being interviewed on news shows regarding approval of the various vaccines. So what was your involvement with that whole process?
I guess twofold. One is I was asked by Francis Collins, who at the time was head of the National Institutes of Health, to be part of a group called the Active Group, I think ACTIV, Accelerating COVID Technologies and Inventions or something like that, Accelerating COVID Technologies and Vaccines. And so in any case, so that was a group of maybe 30 people who were academics and public health officials and government officials and pharmaceutical company representatives, all for the purpose of trying to accelerate the development of this vaccine. So how would this vaccine be made? How would it be tested? So there's that. And I'm also a voting member of the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, which recommends to the FDA whether a vaccine should be, in this case, authorized through emergency use authorization. So that was I came onto the committee in 1997. I'll be on the committee till 2025. So I'm sorry, I came onto the committee in 2017, and I will be on that committee until 2025. So that encompassed this whole COVID vaccine story.
Did you ever wind up voting contrary to the consensus?
More than once. Yeah, not with the initial vaccines. I think where I started to with several other members, disagree with some committee votes, had to do with bivalent vaccines, booster dosing, whether or not this vaccine should be considered in the same way that we consider the influenza vaccine as a yearly vaccine where you pick strains. That's where me and several other committee members would vote no.
Okay, so I heard through the rumor mill that you were offered a consultant position with CNN. Any truth to that?
That's true. No, yeah. So when I first started to go on CNN, they offer you a deal. I think it was like for 3 months, they'll pay you $25,000, something like that, maybe 6 months, but you're theirs. That you are then a medical analyst for CNN. I didn't want that. First of all, I wanted to be able to also do other interviews, and also just for my hospital, because I'm not sure how favorably my hospital looked on this. I wanted to make sure that it would say, Paul Offit Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, because I figured they would like that. And so that therefore they would let me do it more. But I just didn't. Also, I didn't want to do it for the money. I really did. It just felt wrong to do it for the money.
Interesting. So what most surprised you about what went down during the pandemic? One thing I would think of is the speed. I remember everyone at the beginning saying it takes so many years to develop a vaccine, we won't have one for, and then it was an amazingly short period. Did that surprise you?
Yes, that's an easy answer. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be part of a team at Children's Hospital Philadelphia that created a rotavirus vaccine that took roughly 26 years. So my sense of how long things took.
Generation. That's a generation.
Right. Here, it was a novel virus that had unusual characteristics, SARS-CoV-2. It was a novel technology that was going to be used to try and combat this, which is to say the messenger RNA vaccines of Pfizer and Moderna, or the vector virus vaccines of Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca. But what the government did was they took the risk out of it for pharmaceutical companies. Through Operation Warp Speed, they basically put $11 billion into a program to accelerate the development. They took the risk out of it. So they paid for the phase 1 trials and phase 2 trials and phase 3 trials, and they paid to manufacture that vaccine at risk, meaning they were making millions of doses while you were still doing phase 3 trials and didn't know whether it worked or didn't know whether it was safe. I mean, from the time of that virus being isolated and its genome sequence was in January of 2020 to having 2 large phase 3 trials of Pfizer and Moderna's mRNA vaccine, as big as any adult or pediatric vaccine trial, was 11 months. And that's because of Operation Warp Speed. I mean, that was in the Trump administration. They basically bet on 6 horses to win 1 race. And, that never happens. So the only time it ever happened really was the polio vaccine. The March of Dimes did that in 1954, 1955. They also paid pharmaceutical companies to do those trials.
Oh, approximately.
And mass produce it.
How long was the development of the polio vaccine?
Well, if you start from the beginning, I mean, the first polio vaccines were really, 20 years earlier. It was in the 1940s, but both of them failed miserably. And so then you had these later vaccines. But so if you count all that, but certainly from the time of Jonas Salk first doing his work to having a vaccine, it was years. I mean, sort of 5, 6, 7 years.
So it's somewhat ironic that, yes, the Trump administration implemented Project Warp Speed. And so we had this amazing development schedule. And yet it's his followers who mostly don't want to be vaccinated.
And that's under the category of things that surprised me. It surprised me how well these vaccines work. It did. I mean, when Dr. Fauci, I remember talking to Dr. Fauci, and he said that he was hoping that this would be 50% effective, and if so, he would authorize it. And then as we got closer, he was optimistic it could be as much as 70% effective. Because remember, Barney Graham and Kizzmekia Corbett and others at NIH were under NIAID, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is his organization. They did, so he was pretty close to that work. And then as we got closer, we thought, this could be as high as 70% effective. Well, it was 95% effective.
Amazing.
Against severe disease. Against mild disease, it was that good early because that was only a three-month study, but so that had to fade. But protection against severe disease has continued to hold up. So the rapidity with which it was made, the fact that it's still remarkably safe and remarkably effective amazed me. The second thing that amazed me was, so now we had to figure out how to mass produce it, mass distribute it, mass administer this vaccine, which we did pretty quickly. So the January, you're up to like 1 million doses a day, then 2 million, 3 million. By April, you're 3 million doses a day being given to the American public, for which there wasn't an infrastructure to mass vaccinate adults. So all amazing, right? And then we hit an absolute wall. Once we got to 70% immunization rates, there was a solid 30% of people in this country who simply didn't want to get vaccinated, even though we lived through 2020 when we had nothing. We didn't have vaccines, we didn't have antivirals, we didn't have monoclonals. All we had was testing, masking, isolating, quarantining, closing businesses, shuttering schools, restricting travel, trying to just limit human-to-human interaction. We shut down this economy, and now you had something that could save our lives, and people still chose not to get it. It was remarkable to me, that level of denialism and resistance. I would have never predicted that. And all it did in the end was just galvanize these anti-vaccine forces. I would have guessed before this vaccine came out that this would have really hurt the anti-vaccine movement in this country. The opposite was true. It emboldened them. We just leaned into a libertarian left hook by sort of requiring vaccines and requiring masking and mandating it. And that just energize that group.
What would it take? Like a zombie plague, like a real zombie plague, like World War Z or I Am Legend? I don't understand it.
Doesn't this win? I mean, almost 1.2 million people have died in this country, and certainly initially, all of them were chosen to be vaccinated or were unvaccinated. And once a vaccine was available, you still, I mean, we saw it in our hospital. Vaccines were available for children over 16 starting in December. And then it went down to 12 by May, the following May. And still, we'd see kids come into the hospital who weren't vaccinated, their parents weren't vaccinated, the siblings weren't vaccinated. I mean, medicine's hard enough, but here you had children who were coming in on face masks, progressing to ventilation and up into the intensive care unit. Parents are crying. And you're thinking this could have been prevented. It's really hard.
All right, so let's talk about your CSICon presentation. You've titled it, Why So Many COVID Boosters? You're going to give that at Saturday at 9 a.m. And the official description is fairly short for the descriptions here. It says, at this point, most Americans have little idea of what it means to be fully protected against COVID-19. Dr. Paul Offit will summarize why the situation with COVID-19 boosters dosing is so confusing and where the confusion started. So yeah, why is it so confusing? Where did the confusion start?
I think we've made it confusing is why it's confusing. What I'm going to do in this talk is try and go through from the beginning, starting from when SARS-CoV-2 first raised its head in China because of a spillover event on the western section of the Huanan seafood wholesale market in Wuhan. This was not a lab-created virus. This was a animal-to-human spillover event that occurred in China, and it's just sort of traced through, sort of the initial vaccine studies, and then go through what I think were 4 major communications errors that occurred with this. Because if you look, I think we as a general population have less trust in the FDA, less trust in the CDC than we did before this pandemic, and I think. Some of that were just administrative manipulations, like, for example, the Trump administration's twisting the arm of the FDA to authorize hydroxychloroquine, a drug that didn't work to either treat or prevent the disease. But I think others which occurred in the Biden administration, were in many ways equally bad. And I just want to sort of go through where I think we slipped and fell, because not only did I think we lose trust, I think in the general public, I think there were scientists and clinicians who also started to lose trust in the FDA and the CDC. And I want to talk about what I think were the communication errors that allowed for that.
So it's not exactly regarding the vaccines, but like pre-vaccines, the masking issue seems to started off the controversies, because initially, I recall, don't go buy a mask. Masks don't do any good. And then not too long after, oh yeah, go get a mask. And, cloth masks don't do any good. You need a really good mask. So did that guidance change, do you think, cause people to lose faith?
Yes, although, you learn as you go. I mean, that's the nature of science. I think the beauty of science, the value of science is it's enormously self-correcting. We learn as we go, and then we're willing to take textbooks and throw them over our shoulder without a backward glance as we learn more and more. I mean, I remember when I was a pediatric resident in Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh, we were taught that after a child fed, that you should lay them on their stomach so they don't regurgitate the formula or the breast milk into their windpipe and then their lungs. Bad advice. As it turns out, that actually increased the risk of sudden infant death syndrome. In the early 90s, which was a decade after I'd left pediatric residency, the American Academy of Pediatrics started their back to sleep program. So now you lay children on their back. So that doesn't mean that the pediatricians that taught me during my residency were ignorant. It just means we didn't know that at the time. So you learn as you go. And I think, for example, mask, don't mask. We learned more about the value of masking over time. We learned more about the value of, sort of the surgical mask, and especially the N95 or KN95 masks over time. And so, but you're right. It makes it look like you don't know what you're doing. On the other hand, you should always go with the data. And when you switch and then go with the data, it looks like you don't know what you're doing. So in many ways, it's lose-lose. But I do think the people need to understand that. I think if you ask people, do you think that we're going to know more 100 years from now about science and medicine than we know now? I think everybody would say yes. But when it comes to your disease, or in this case, this pandemic virus, they want you to know everything you need to know right now, and that's never going to be true.
Where does the population of this country stand regarding where they should be right now, and how dangerous is that?
Well, most people have either been vaccinated or naturally infected or both. I mean, if you look at these sort of sero surveys, you have probably at least 96 to 97% population immunity at this point, which is why I think the pandemic is over. I mean, if you define a pandemic as something that changes the way you live, work, or play, this is not a pandemic anymore. People are going back to life as normal. I mean, you see big indoor crowds at sporting events over the winter. So I think, we're done. But the virus isn't done. I mean, this virus will be circulating for years, if not decades, if not centuries. I mean, there are 4 strains of human coronavirus that currently circulate in this country that account for maybe 10 or 15% of the hospitalizations we see every winter. One of those strains came into the world in the late 1700s. Another came into the world in the late 1800s. I think you can assume this virus is going to be with us for a long time. So the virus isn't over, but I think this virus will likely join the pantheon of other winter respiratory viruses that cause, as collectively, hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations and tens of thousands of deaths every year. The good news is we have a vaccine that can prevent it. And the better news is that although this virus does evolve to become more and more resistant to protection against mild disease, it really hasn't evolved away from protection against severe disease. Even if you were just inoculated with 3 doses of that original vaccine, the so-called ancestral strain vaccine, you're still protected against serious disease, assuming you're a healthy young person. So that's the good news. And I think we'll see how this plays out.
How infectious are the current strains? Are the ones that are now circulating less infectious and or less virulent?
They're certainly not less virulent. I mean, there was a study out of Hong Kong just in the last couple of weeks that looked at, and it was hard to do this study, but you looked at people who had neither been naturally infected or vaccinated earlier in the pandemic when it was the Alpha variant and the Delta variant, and then looked at also people who later in the pandemic when Omicron, and we're still in the Omicron era, when Omicron was circulating, who also were not naturally infected or vaccinated, to answer the question, if you were over 65, were you less likely to be hospitalized if you were infected with the Omicron strain as compared to these earlier strains? And the answer was no, it was the same. So I think that this, when you do the study the right way, which is to try and control for the fact that most people have already been naturally infected or vaccinated, you find that there's really no change in virulence. There's certainly no change in the incubation period, which is around 3 or 4 days. And I think there's little change in the contagiousness, with the exception of the fact that because these viruses continue to evolve, you become, you're not as protected against mild illness. So I think I've had one COVID infection. I suspect I will have, more as time goes on, in much the same way that I get a flu infection occasionally, or respiratory syncytial virus infection, or paraflu infection, or human metapneumovirus infection every winter, rhinovirus infections. I think this will enter that realm.
So yeah, on a personal note, I've had 6 shots, and I also have had one infection that I know about. So do I need another booster, or am I done?
I think what a booster buys you is it buys you a few months of better protection against mild illness. That's what it does. But I don't see that as a viable public health strategy. I think the goal of this vaccine is to keep you out of the hospital, out of the intensive care unit, out of the morgue. And even the original Wuhan strain vaccine, the ancestral strain vaccine, continues to do that. And the reason is that although the virus continues to evolve away from antibody recognition, it's never really evolved much away from T cell recognition. So whether you look at Wuhan 1 or you look at these current Omicron strains, the so-called XBB strains, T cell epitopes are still conserved. And if you had to pick one part of your immune system that's really the most responsible for protecting you against disease, it's cytotoxic T cells. And so that's the good news about this virus. Now, it may evolve away from T cell recognition, in which case we're starting all over again, but that hasn't happened, and it may never happen.
Last year, I was surprised when I went to CSICon that I was one of the minority wearing a mask a year ago. So I'm going again this year, and I'm wondering if I should wear a mask. And that's why my friend was asking me, should she wear a mask? Are we done with that?
Here's what I would say. Every winter, there are viruses that circulate that can cause hospitalization and death, more commonly in people who are older and have various comorbidities. Otherwise, usually it's a milder infection. I think if you have symptoms, respiratory symptoms, I think, and you should stay home until you feel better. If you can't do that, if you have to go out, then wear a mask. If you're in a large indoor setting and you're older and you have various health problems, it's probably reasonable to wear a mask anyway, because any of these viruses can kill you, whether it's flu, influenza, or parainfluenza. There's 150,000 people who are over 60 years of age that die every year from respiratory syncytial virus. So I'm not sure why we've grandfathered those viruses in. Like, it's okay to get those viruses. I mean, they're all bad. So it's just a matter of being sort of using common sense.
It's clearly a cultural thing, because I worked in a big office, and we had some people who were originally from one of the East Asian countries. And when they came into work with a slight cold or something, they would wear a mask. And that was like weird to the Westerners. It's like, what are you doing? I have a cold, I don't wear a mask. But yeah, so this may have, the silver lining might be that you're not, as an American Westerner, not from a culture where that has been okay to do for a long time. Maybe now it's okay to do that. If you're particularly vulnerable, or you have a cold yourself, you won't look like a freak essentially if you're wearing a mask.
We'll see. You're right. The first time I went to Japan, I remember I was surprised by the fact that everybody's on the subway, everybody's wearing a mask, and
pre-COVID this was.
Yeah, pre-COVID. I would be surprised if that in any way changed what we did over time, but I could be wrong. But I hope I'm wrong. I hope that if you wear your mask, that people don't make fun of you.
So is this your first CSICon?
No, I've been to CSICon.
And have you given talks?
I have. Yeah, I enjoy CSICon. It's fun. It's all my heroes.
Have you seen the speakers list this year? Anyone you're particularly looking forward to?
Richard Dawkins is going to be there, right? Isn't Michael Shermer's going to be there too, isn't he?
Oh, no, I don't think Shermer, unless that's a change I'm not aware of. I'm actually interviewing Dawkins in a few weeks. That should be interesting. Yeah, will you be staying the entire con, attending the Halloween
I'm going to stay
party?
the first 2 days. Then we're going to take the red eye back, I think, on Saturday night. Because you don't want to miss the Eagles game on Sunday.
So you're not going to be at the Halloween party. So I was going to ask you if the costume was going to be, a hypodermic or something. As I recall, Thomas Westbrook and his partner won a prize at the Halloween party maybe 3 years ago. It was a 50s theme, and they came as Sputnik and the polio vaccine, and they won a prize. Okay, I think this is a good place to wrap it up.
Great.
Thanks so much for giving me your time today, and I'm looking forward to meeting you in real life in Las Vegas in just 3 months.
All right, take care. Thank you.